In Nebraska, the wind never really stays silent. It's a relentless, haunting sound that scrapes across the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It feels like the land itself is trying to tell you something, or perhaps it's trying to claw back the secrets you've buried in the dirt. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm 26 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've lived like a ghost on the outskirts of Scotsbluff. This farm, these wide-open plains, they were supposed to be my past, not my forever. I was 20, halfway out the door to chase a life in the city, when a single phone call turned my world into a heap of twisted metal and broken glass. My parents were gone, and in an instant, I wasn't a dreamer anymore. I was a target. Every greedy relative on both sides of the family circled like vultures, waiting for me to fail so they could pick the bones of this land clean. That specific Tuesday started like any other under the high, pale Nebraska sky. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the fields, and the long shadows of the afternoon stretched out like fingers across the dusty earth. I was out by the fence line, my shirt soaked with sweat, pounding new posts into the ground to replace the ones that had rotted during the last winter freeze. It was backbreaking work, the kind that keeps your mind too busy to ache. But then, the silence of the plains was broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I didn't get many visitors, especially not ones driving a battered silver Ford Focus that sounded like it was running on its last breath. When the engine finally sputtered to a stop, the door creaked open, and Emma stepped out. She looked smaller than the girl I remembered from high school, her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying the weight of the entire sky. Her eyes were hollow, framed by the kind of dark circles that only come from weeks of terror and sleeplessness. She stood at the end of the driveway for a long moment, clutching a worn-out shoulder bag in a small, locked wooden box as if her life depended on it. She looked at the horizon, then at the house, and finally, her gaze settled on me. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was thin, trembling just enough to make my chest tighten. She didn't come closer at first. She just stood there, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "My father, before he passed, he told me to come here. He said you were a man of your word. He said you might need a wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. I straightened up, leaning my shovel against the post, my mind racing to find a reason to say no. But before I could speak, she stepped into my space, the words tumbling out of her in a desperate rush. She told me she was out of options. She had lost her job, her landlord was evicting her, and she had nowhere left to run. She talked about Omaha like it was a graveyard. But as I looked at her, I saw more than just poverty. I saw the same raw vulnerability that I felt every morning when I woke up in an empty house. She was drowning, and I was the only piece of solid ground she had left. I didn't know then that she was bringing a storm with her, one that would either forge us together or bury us both in the Nebraska silt. 2 days later, the air had turned crisp, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and turning leaves. We stood inside the small, white-timbered church on the edge of town, a building that had seen generations of Fosters and Greens baptized, married, and buried. This wasn't the wedding of anyone's dreams. There were no grand bouquets of roses, no string quartet, and no celebration waiting for us at the end of the aisle. The only music was the low moan of the wind against the stained glass and the rhythmic ticking of the old clock at the back of the sanctuary. I wore my father's suit, the one he only took out for funerals and the rare Sunday when he felt like a king. It was a little loose on me, a constant reminder of the man I was still trying to grow into, and the fabric felt heavy against my skin, like a layer of armor. The ceremony was presided over by Pastor Tom, a man who had known me since I was high enough to reach the church pews. He looked at us with a mix of pity and profound understanding. He knew the stories circling the town. He knew that the boy who lost his parents was now marrying the girl who had lost her way. When he spoke of commitment and finding light in the dark, his voice echoed through the near-empty room, landing on the ears of the few neighbors who had come out of morbid curiosity. But my eyes were fixed on the back row. There sat Aunt Marjorie, her spine as straight as a blade, her black dress blending into the shadows. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She watched Emma like a predator evaluates a new threat in its territory. When it came time for the vows, my voice felt like it was being pulled from deep within my chest. I took out my mother's ring, a simple band of silver, worn thin by decades of hard work and devotion. As I slipped it onto Emma's finger, I felt her hand trembling. Her skin was ice-cold despite the heating in the church. She looked up at me, and for a split second, the mask of the destitute city girl slipped. I saw a flash of something sharp and calculating in her eyes, a look that told me she wasn't just here to be saved, she was here to fight. She repeated her vows in a whisper that was barely audible, but firm. It felt less like a romantic promise and more like a blood oath sworn in the middle of a battlefield. We walked out of the church as husband and wife, but the air outside felt heavier than when we entered. The town was already talking. I could see the curtains twitching in the houses across the street and hear the low murmurs of the women standing by the bakery. They called it a rushed affair, a marriage of convenience, or worse, a scandal. They didn't see the way Emma gripped that locked wooden box as we climbed into my truck. They didn't see the way she looked over her shoulder at the black SUV parked a block away, the one that started its engine the moment we pulled onto the main road. Back at the farm, the reality of our situation settled in like a thick fog. We shared our first meal at the scarred kitchen table, cold cuts and rye bread, eaten in a silence that was almost deafening. Emma didn't ask for much. She claimed the spare bedroom, the one that still smelled of my mother's lavender sachets and old books. As I watched her retreat into the shadows of the hallway, I realized that I didn't truly know the woman I had just tied my life to. I had given her my name and my protection, but she was still a stranger in my house, carrying a secret that was already beginning to bleed into the floorboards of the Foster legacy. The first night of our marriage wasn't spent in each other's arms. It was spent staring at the ceiling, listening to the floorboards creak, and wondering which of us would break first. As the weeks bled into a cold, biting autumn, we settled into a routine that felt more like a truce than a marriage. Every morning, the sun would rise over the frost-covered plains, a pale, heatless disk that barely warmed the air. Emma took to the vegetable garden with a ferocity that surprised me. She was out there at dawn, her hands buried in the freezing earth, pulling weeds as if she were trying to extract something hidden deep beneath the roots. I would watch her from the barn, the way she moved with a quiet, guarded grace, never quite letting her back stay turned to the road for too long. We were learning the dance of two people living in a house built for ghosts, careful not to step on each other's shadows, careful not to ask the questions that lingered in the steam of our coffee. But the peace was an illusion, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark lake. The first crack appeared at the general store. I had gone in to sell a few crates of eggs and pick up some feed, the same trip I'd made every Saturday for years. Usually, Mr. Harlan would lean over the counter and tell me some stale joke about the weather, but that morning, the air in the store was different. It was thick with a cold, unspoken judgment. Harlan kept his eyes on the ledger, his movements stiff. He told me the market was saturated, and he couldn't take my eggs this week. When I stepped back out onto the sidewalk, I saw a group of men from the local farmers' co-op. They stopped talking the moment I approached, their gazes sliding past me as if I were a stranger. I realized then that Marjorie hadn't just been whispering. She had been poisoning the well. When I got back to the farm, I found Emma sitting on the porch, her locked wooden box resting on her knees. She didn't hear me approach. She was staring at the lock, her thumb tracing the brass edges with a frantic, repetitive motion. When she finally noticed me, she jumped, nearly dropping the box, and shoved it behind her back. I didn't ask what was inside, not yet. I told her about the store, about the cold shoulders in town, and the way the feed prices had suddenly spiked without warning. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting for the hammer to fall. "It's not just gossip, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They don't want you to fail. They want you to disappear." That night, for the first time, I didn't go straight to my room. I sat in the living room by the dying embers of the fireplace, listening to the house groan under the weight of the wind. I heard Emma's door creak open. She walked into the kitchen, thinking I was asleep, and I watched her through the doorway. She wasn't getting water. She was standing by the window, peering through a slit in the curtains at the dark driveway. I saw the silhouette of a car, lights off, engine idling, parked just beyond the fence line. It sat there for 10 minutes, a black shadow against the gray plains, before slowly rolling away. Emma turned around and saw me sitting in the dark. She didn't scream. She just slumped against the counter, the moonlight catching the tears on her cheeks. "They're coming for it, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "They think I have the deeds. They think my father stole the rights to the aquifer." I stood up, the floorboards complaining under my weight, and walked toward her. I wanted to tell her she was safe, but as I looked out at the vast, empty darkness of my land, I realized I was just as trapped as she was. We weren't just husband and wife. We were two people barricaded inside a fortress that was already starting to crumble. The isolation of the farm, which had once been my sanctuary, was now becoming our cage. Part 4. The Shadow of the Syndicate. The following morning, the atmosphere on the farm shifted from uneasy to predatory. It started with a formal letter, delivered not by the mailman, but by a man in a sharp charcoal suit who didn't mind getting his expensive Italian shoes dusty. He was a representative from Apex Resources, a name I'd only seen on the news in connection with massive land acquisitions out west. He didn't come with a threat. He came with an offer, a number so large it felt like a hallucination. They wanted the riverfront acreage, the fertile strip of land that had been the Foster heartbeat for 3 generations. But there was a catch hidden in the legal jargon. They wanted full, irrevocable water rights. They weren't buying soil. They were buying the lifeblood of the entire county. I tore the offer up right in front of him, but the man didn't flinch. He simply looked toward the house, where Emma was watching from the screen door, and smiled a thin, knowing smile. "Stubbornness is an expensive hobby, Mr. Foster," he said before driving away. An hour later, my phone rang. It was the bank. Marjorie's influence had finally reached the ledgers. They were calling in a loan I didn't even know was at risk, citing instability in management and concerns over the property's legal standing. It was a coordinated strike. They were squeezing the air out of the room, waiting for us to gasp for help. I found Emma in the kitchen, her face pale as she stared at the shredded remains of the Apex offer on the table. She finally set the wooden box down between us and pushed it toward me. "It's time you saw what's in here," she said, her voice hollow. I opened the lock. The key had been hidden in the lining of her bag all along. Inside weren't jewels or money. It was a stack of old, yellowed maps and a series of correspondence between her father, Albert, and my parents from the year they died. There were also photos, blurry images of surveyors marking the Foster land under the cover of night, long before the accident. As I sifted through the papers, the truth began to emerge, more jagged and painful than the scar on my cheek. My parents hadn't just died in a car crash on a rain-slicked road. They had been fighting a legal war against a syndicate that Marjorie had helped bring to Scotsbluff. Albert had been their secret witness, the one who held the proof that the water rights had been illegally diverted years ago. The accident happened 2 days before they were supposed to meet a federal auditor. My breath hitched as I realized that the people who wanted my land were the same people who had cleared the path for my parents' deaths. Emma hadn't come to me just for a husband. She had come because she was the final piece of a puzzle that people were willing to kill for. "I didn't tell you at first because I didn't know if I could trust you," Emma whispered, her eyes searching mine. "I thought maybe you were in on it, or maybe you were too broken to care. But then I saw the way you looked at Marjorie in the church. I saw that you were just as much a prisoner of this town as I am." I reached across the table and took her hand, her skin finally starting to warm. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was the silence of 2 soldiers in a trench. We weren't just a farmer and a fugitive anymore. We were the only thing standing between a multi-million-dollar corporation and the destruction of our home. But as the first rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, I knew that the syndicate wasn't going to wait for a court date. They were going to use the weather to wash their problems away. The humidity that evening was thick enough to choke the lungs, a heavy, stagnant weight that signaled a change in the atmosphere. The Nebraska sky had turned a bruised shade of purple, and the wind had died down to an eerie, unnatural stillness. I spent the evening checking the perimeter, my nerves frayed, feeling like 1,000 eyes were watching from the swaying stalks of the cornfields. Emma was inside, her silhouette moving past the kitchen window as she paced, the wooden box now tucked safely under the floorboards of the pantry. We didn't speak much that night. The air was too charged with the electricity of the coming storm for words. I fell into a shallow, restless sleep on the sofa, my boots still on, my hand resting on the hilt of an old hunting knife. It was the smell that woke me, not the sweet scent of rain, but the acrid, chemical sting of gasoline and burning treated timber. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the darkness was being eaten away by a flickering, angry orange glow. I didn't even have to look out the window to know. The livestock barn, the structure that held my winter feed and the heart of my operation, was an inferno. "Emma, get out. Now." I roared, lunging for the door. She met me in the hallway, her eyes wide with a primal terror I had never seen before. We didn't waste time with shoes or coats. We burst out into the night, and the heat hit us like a physical wall. The flames were leaping 30 feet into the air, whipped into a frenzy by a sudden, violent gust of wind that preceded the rain. This wasn't a brush fire. This was arson. I could see the trail of fuel shimmering on the grass, a black ribbon leading straight to the foundation of the barn. We fought it with a desperation that bordered on madness. I grabbed the heavy industrial hose from the well, the water pressure struggling to compete with the roaring heat, while Emma hauled buckets from the trough, her hands blistering as she threw water into the mouth of the beast. The smoke was thick and black, filling our lungs until every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. In the chaos, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the woods, a shadow among shadows, watching the destruction with a chilling, detached calm. Before I could move toward them, a piece of the roof collapsed with a deafening crack, sending a shower of sparks into the dry grass around us. We managed to contain the spread, saved only by the first heavy, fat drops of rain that began to fall from the sky. As the fire died down to a smoldering, blackened skeleton, we stood in the mud, soaked to the bone and shivering despite the heat of the embers. Emma collapsed to her knees, her face streaked with soot and tears. "They won't stop, Daniel," she choked out, her voice breaking. "They'll burn us out, or they'll bury us here. Maybe if I leave, they'll leave you alone." I walked over to her and pulled her up from the muck, my grip firm, almost bruising. I wiped the soot from her forehead, my own hands shaking. "No," I said, my voice raspy from the smoke. "If you go, they win. They killed my parents for this dirt, and they tried to kill us tonight. From here on out, we don't just defend. We fight back." That night, we didn't go back to our separate rooms. We sat on the kitchen floor, leaning against each other, watching the rain wash the ash off the porch. The line between a marriage of convenience and a bond of survival had finally vanished. We were one entity now, forged in the heat of that fire, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something more dangerous than Marjorie's greed. I felt the cold, hard resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. The rain that had saved us from the fire was only the scout for a much larger army. By the following afternoon, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised green, a color that signaled the kind of Nebraska weather that makes even the oldest farmers pray. The wind began to howl, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the window panes and made the teeth ache. The Platte River, usually a lazy ribbon of silver in the distance, was beginning to swell, transformed by the upstream runoff into an angry, churning monster. I spent the day frantically boarding up the windows and securing the remaining livestock, but my eyes were constantly drawn to the road. We were isolated. The phones were down, and the gravel path was rapidly turning into a river of mud. Emma was a whirlwind of motion, her fear replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. She was packing the documents from the wooden box into waterproof casings, her knuckles white as she worked. "Marjorie knows we have the maps now," she said over the roar of the wind. "The fire wasn't just to scare us. It was a distraction. They're going to use this storm to finish what they started 6 years ago." I wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, but then I saw it, the glint of metal through the sheets of rain. A truck was parked at the gate, its headlights cut, sitting like a predator in the tall grass. The storm hit its peak at midnight. It felt as if the house were being hit by a freight train. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of tearing shingles and snapping branches. Then came the scream. It wasn't the wind. It was Emma. I found her in the mud near the chicken coop. She had gone out to check the secondary latch, but the runoff had surged, turning the low ground into a waist-deep torrent. She was clinging to a fence post, her legs being swept out from under her by the debris-filled water. I lunged for her, my boots slipping in the muck, my heart leaping into my throat. Just as I reached out my hand, a massive sheet of corrugated tin, ripped from the remains of the scorched barn, took flight. It caught the wind like a sail and whipped across the yard with the speed of a guillotine. I didn't have time to dodge. The edge of the metal sliced across my cheek, a hot, searing line of agony that blinded me instantly with blood. I fell back into the water, the world spinning, the roar of the storm fading into a high-pitched ring. I felt Emma's hands on me, her fingers digging into my shoulders, pulling my head above the rising tide. "Daniel, look at me. Stay with me," she screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. In that moment of absolute terror, with the blood mixing with the cold rain and the earth literally moving beneath us, the truth finally broke through my defenses. I wasn't just protecting a neighbor's daughter. I wasn't just fulfilling a promise to a dead man. I reached up, my hand trembling as I framed her face, her skin slick with rain and tears. "If we don't make it out," I coughed, the metallic taste of blood thick in my mouth, "I need you to know, it wasn't the deal. It was you. I love you, Emma." She didn't answer with words. She pulled my head toward hers, and our lips met in a kiss that tasted of salt, iron, and desperation. It was a collision of two souls who had spent their lives being discarded, finally finding an anchor in the middle of a hurricane. The world was tearing itself apart around us, but for that one heartbeat, the storm didn't matter. We scrambled out of the mud, battered and bleeding, and fought our way back to the porch. We were broken, the farm was drowning, and I was losing blood fast. But as we barred the door against the night, I knew that Marjorie had underestimated us. She thought she was fighting a farmer and a runaway. She didn't realize she was fighting a family. The morning after the storm felt like the end of the world. The wind had died down to a low, mournful hum, and the sun broke through the clouds with a cruel, blinding brightness that illuminated the wreckage. The farm was a landscape of gray mud and twisted metal. My face was a map of pain. Emma had stitched the gash on my cheek with a sewing needle and fishing line while the power was out, her hands steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We sat in the kitchen, the air smelling of damp wood and ozone, and spread the contents of the waterproof casings across the table. We had survived the water and the fire, and now it was time to unleash the ghosts. As we meticulously organized the documents from Albert's box alongside the old files my parents had hidden, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't just a simple land grab. The maps showed a massive underground aquifer, a subterranean river of pure water that spanned 3 counties, with its most accessible point located directly beneath the Foster riverfront. Marjorie hadn't just been greedy. She was a shareholder in a front company designed to siphon that water and sell it back to the state during the drought. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten ledger. It wasn't my father's handwriting. It was Marjorie's late husband's. In the ledger, there were dates and dollar amounts, payments made to a local mechanic who specialized in brake lines. The dates coincided exactly with the week of my parents' fatal accident. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the entries. "They didn't just want the land, Daniel," she whispered. "They killed them because your father found the illegal tap they had already installed. He was going to the authorities, and they turned his car into a coffin." The betrayal felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. My own family had traded my parents' lives for a seat at a corporate table. We spent the day gathering more than just papers. We drove into town, the truck fishtailing through the mud, to visit the few people Marjorie hadn't managed to buy. We went to see Old Man Ellis, a retired mechanic who lived in a trailer on the edge of the county. When I showed him the ledger, his face went ashen. He had been the one Marjorie's husband approached 6 years ago. He had refused, but he had stayed silent out of fear. I saw the black SUV following them that night. Ellis confessed, his voice cracking. I saw it nudge them toward the bridge. "I've been drinking myself to death for 6 years, trying to forget the sound of that impact." We didn't go to the local sheriff. Marjorie had him in her pocket. Instead, we drove 2 hours to the state capitol, bypassing the local corruption to find an old friend of Albert's who worked in the Attorney General's office. Emma carried the box like a holy relic. We were covered in mud. I was wearing a blood-stained bandage on my face, and we looked like we had crawled out of a grave. But as we laid the evidence out on the mahogany desk of the state investigator, the room went silent. The maps, the ledger, the witness statements. It was a mountain of evidence that no amount of small-town influence could bury. We weren't just protecting a farm anymore. We were providing the rope for Marjorie's gallows. As we walked out of the building, the weight of 6 years of grief finally began to shift, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. The county courthouse in Scotsbluff felt more like a fortress than a hall of justice. It was a squat, red brick building that had stood for a century, its hallways smelling of floor wax and old, dusty secrets. On the day of the hearing, the air was thick with a tension that felt like a physical weight. The benches were packed with locals, some out of loyalty to the Foster name, others out of a morbid curiosity to see the city girl and the scarred farmer finally break. Marjorie arrived like a queen in exile, draped in expensive black silk, her expression a mask of bored indifference. She didn't look at us. She looked through us, as if we were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience on her path to total control. As the proceedings began, Marjorie's lawyer, a man with a voice like polished glass, opened with a surgical strike against our character. He painted our marriage as a desperate fraud, a calculated move by a mentally unstable young man and a debt-ridden fugitive to circumvent the bank's legitimate claims. He spoke of my father's financial mismanagement and Emma's shadowy past in Omaha. For an hour, we sat there while our lives were picked apart like roadkill. I felt Emma's hand tighten in mine, her fingernails digging into my palm. I could see the doubt flickering in the eyes of the spectators. In a small town, a well-told lie often carries more weight than a messy truth. But then, it was our turn. We didn't lead with the maps or the water rights. We led with the ghosts. We called Old Man Ellis to the stand. He looked frail, his hands shaking as he gripped the Bible, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man seeking salvation. He told the court about the night of the accident. He told them about the black SUV and the ledger. The silence in the room was absolute as he recounted the screams he'd spent 6 years trying to drown in a bottle. I watched Marjorie's face. The mask didn't slip, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped her handbag. The climax came when the state investigator presented the digital trail we had uncovered, emails between Marjorie and Apex Resources discussing liquidating the Foster asset by any means necessary. But Marjorie had one final, desperate card to play. She stood up, interrupting her own counsel, and produced a document that had been buried in the county archives for 50 years. It was a deed transfer from my grandfather to Albert Green, Emma's father. She claimed that because of an old, unpaid debt, the Foster family had never actually owned the land. She intended to prove that the farm belonged to the Green estate, which was currently tied up in probate, a move that would allow the bank to seize it instantly. The room erupted in whispers. Marjorie smiled, a cold, jagged expression of victory. She thought she had won. She thought that by proving I wasn't the owner, she had destroyed my standing. But she didn't know Emma. Emma stood up slowly, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the murmurs. "You're right, Marjorie," she said, looking her aunt in the eye for the first time. "I am the legal heir to this land. My father was the owner. And as the owner, I have the right to decide its future. And I've already made my decision." She pulled a final document from her bag, a legally binding contract, signed and notarized that morning, transferring the land into a perpetual community trust. In one move, she had made the land impossible to sell or exploit. She hadn't just saved the farm. She had removed the profit motive that had killed my parents. Marjorie's face didn't just pale, it crumbled. The predator had finally found herself caught in a trap of her own making. The fall of Marjorie was not a loud explosion, but a slow, agonizing crumble. As the judge reviewed the documents Emma had presented, the air in the courtroom seemed to thin. The charges against my aunt quickly spiraled from civil fraud to criminal conspiracy and attempted arson. Watching the bailiffs lead her away was like watching a mountain finally slide into the sea. It was quiet, heavy, and irreversible. She didn't scream or protest. She simply withered, her silk dress and gold rings suddenly looking like the hollow costumes of a forgotten era. The townspeople filed out in a stunned silence, their whispers now directed at the floorboards instead of our backs. They had seen the monster behind the curtain, and they realized they had been cheering for it. When we stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the Nebraska sky was a brilliant, untroubled blue. The mud was drying, and for the first time in 6 years, the wind didn't feel like it was trying to push me over. Emma leaned against one of the stone pillars, her strength finally giving out. She began to cry, not the quiet, desperate tears of a victim, but the jagged, heaving sobs of someone who has finally put down a crushing weight. I held her right there, in front of the whole town, my scarred face pressed against her hair. We were bruised, our home was a wreck, and our bank account was empty, but we were finally, truly free. The following months were a blur of reconstruction. The trust Emma had created meant that while we didn't own the land in the traditional sense, we were its permanent stewards. We couldn't sell it, and neither could anyone else. It was protected for the community, ensuring the aquifer would never be drained by a corporation. This news changed the way the town looked at us. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid us now showed up with hammers and lumber. Mr. Harlan arrived one Saturday with a truckload of high-grade seed and a quiet apology. It wasn't that the town had suddenly become perfect. It was that they realized we were the only ones who had fought for their future as much as our own. By the time the first snow began to dust the plains, the barn had been rebuilt. The wood was fresh and smelled of pine, a stark contrast to the charred ruins of the summer. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. We had turned the spare room into a nursery, painting it a soft, warm yellow. Emma's baking business, which had started as a way to hide from the world, began to flourish as a legitimate enterprise. People drove from 2 counties away for her cornmeal pies, but I knew they were really coming to see the woman who had stood her ground against the syndicate. One evening, as the first real blizzard of the season rattled the shutters, Emma sat by the fire, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. We had survived the fire, the flood, and the greed of our own blood, and now we were waiting for a new life to join us. I sat at her feet, cleaning the same hunting knife I'd gripped in the dark months ago, but the tension was gone from my shoulders. I used to think this land was a curse, I murmured, looking into the flames. I thought it was a graveyard that kept me tied to a tragedy. Emma reached down, her fingers tracing the jagged line of the scar on my cheek. It's not a graveyard anymore, Daniel, she whispered. It's a foundation. We didn't just stay, we grew. The summer arrived with a gentleness that felt like a gift from the land itself. The Nebraska plains were no longer a battlefield of dust and wind, but a sea of vibrant green, swaying in rhythm with a breeze that finally carried the scent of life instead of smoke. The Platte River had retreated to its banks, leaving behind fertile silt that made the garden thrive beyond anything we had ever seen. On the hill under the old oak tree, the spot where I once sat in total isolation, grieving the ghosts of my past, I finished building a long wooden bench. The wood was solid, anchored deep into the soil, much like our lives had become. Emma walked out from the house, the morning sun catching the golden highlights in her hair. She moved with a new confidence, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, wearing one of my old flannel shirts that had become her favorite. She sat beside me on the bench, and for a long time, we simply watched the horizon. There was no black SUV in the distance, no looming shadows of corporate greed, just the wide-open sky and the sound of the cattle grazing in the distance. The silence between us had evolved. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge. I spent so many years thinking I was a prisoner here, I said, my voice low and steady. I thought my parents' death had chained me to this dirt. But looking at you, and knowing what we've built, I realized the land wasn't the cage. The fear was. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers interlaced with mine. We both had to lose everything to realize what actually mattered, she replied. I didn't come here to be a wife, Daniel. I came here to survive. But I stayed because you showed me that survival isn't enough. You have to have something worth fighting for. The birth of our daughter, Abigail, came in the heat of July. The house was filled with the sounds of her cries, a sharp, beautiful noise that chased the last of the lingering ghosts from the hallways. The town greeted her arrival not with whispers of scandal, but with baskets of food and hand-knitted blankets. Even Harlan showed up at the door, awkwardly holding a tiny pair of leather boots, a silent gesture of respect for the family that had saved the county's water. We were no longer the lonely farmer and the city runaway. We were the Fosters, the guardians of the trust, the people who had looked into the eye of the storm and refused to blink. As the sun began to set on that warm summer evening, painting the clouds in shades of deep violet and gold, I stood on the porch holding Abigail. She had Emma's eyes, bright, piercing, and full of a future that wouldn't be dictated by debt or ancient family feuds. I looked at the scar on my cheek in the reflection of the window. It had faded to a pale line, a permanent map of the night. I found out what love actually meant. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a mark of victory. We had lost our parents, our peace, and our innocence to the greed of others. But in the wreckage of the fire and the flood, we had found something unbreakable. Happiness, it turned out, wasn't a grand destination or a pile of wealth. It was the simple, quiet reality of a roof that didn't leak, a field that belonged to the future, and a partner who stayed when the world told them to run. I pulled Emma close as the first stars appeared over the Nebraska plains. The wind was still blowing, as it always does, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for threats. I was just listening to the heartbeat of my family, finally home.